Welcome back, people. This is JFace Games. I am Trent, aka JFace, I guess. And what we're going to talk about real quick is two games that we've already talked about. I've probably talked about them to death, and I don't know how this is going to fit in. I'm actually coming to this video without an idea in advance. Also, you'll see, I think you would have seen it in the last video, that I flushed out all of this stuff down here that could be filled out, could not be, in terms of building this game. Some of this stuff might not be necessary. Some of this stuff might be highly relevant. This is what we've actually currently worked on. So let's go ahead and we will highlight that in some shape, way, or form. Boop. Whereas all this stuff down here, I've just put out there as ideas that, yeah, I'd love to know more about that. What does that look like? Does that matter in my game? So it's just thrown out there. Now, the two games I want to talk about that I've killed in terms of talking about are, they're both the LCGs, Arkham Horror LCG and Marvel Champions, right? We've already talked about some of the things they do that is wonderful, and I want to talk about one other thing, and I don't know how this fits into the game, because once again, we'll talk about it. So Marvel Champions, what it does is that it has a nemesis. So we've talked about that game already, that you are a superhero, you're one of the Marvel characters. You're both your superhero role and your alter ego. You're fighting a big bad guy, you're dealing with his scheme, etc. And what's happening is, as you're playing, the bad guy has this encounter deck, stuff's flying out at you, minions, different scenarios, etc., etc. And you're trying to whittle him down, the main bad guy, and deal with this stuff as it comes out. Well, every character in that game, to add a little bit of flavor to you being you, has a nemesis. Right? You have the person that you hate. Hulk has Abomination. Black Widow has Taskmaster. Spider-Man has, I think, Vulture in this game. So you all have this arch enemy that is, you're destined to battle with forever. And what happens in that game is, if a certain card comes out in the encounter deck at a certain time, then what happens is your nemesis that's set aside will now come into play, engaged with you, and now you're having to deal with them. In Arkham Horror, what they have is that they do it a little differently. They have a card called a Treachery card, where these Treachery cards are weakness cards. These weakness cards are things that are really bad for you when they come up, and they're actually in your deck. So now when you're drawing cards from your deck, there is a little bit of a stress. That game's all about stress and freaking you out the whole time. It's a wonderful game. But there's a little bit of a stress when you're drawing cards. You don't want to burn through your deck because your weakness might come out. When your weakness comes out, it usually really sucks. It's something that's like an addiction. You lose all your money, or just random stuff, right? And it's a tight game in terms of the economy and the actual mechanics going on. And so any hit is tough to get over. But they're both very flavorful. The weaknesses are very flavorful. The nemesis coming out is very flavorful, right? So how do you do that in a game like an RPG? Now, you could just easily say that that's up to the DM, right? The DM should, which I agree to an extent, most tabletop RPGs, that's what you do, is that you understand the character's backstory. Maybe just in your game, you're building up a arch nemesis, or the main bad guy and his lieutenants, and you make sure that they live at the end of the fight so they can come back later, or a rival party, and the rival party is leveling up simultaneously, and that's their enemy. And so maybe that's on the DM to just build that in, but that's hard to do. I've done that a couple of times in my games, and it's not easy to manage that. Especially now that there's sort of a push and a wave for online DMs to say, no prep, no prep, or minimal prep. And I felt like when I was ever trying to do those things, I was having to over prep. So the question is, can you build a mechanic that is in a TTRPG that tackles that same sort of concept, right? How do you build that mechanic in? So is it something that's on their initial character sheet, that their initial character sheet already has that? And then it's something like rolling crit fails might bring that about? Is it something like 13th Age, where you have that icon die, where you roll the d6 at the beginning of the session we're about to play. You roll that d6, and if you got a 6, that means your icon is going to intervene in some way. Is it the same thing, but now with a nemesis, and you roll a 1 at the beginning of the session? That could be really fun, because then it's not as like, if you do it on multiple crit fails, like if you get 2 crit fails in a row, now you're, that could be very unthematic. Like all of a sudden it's like, oh, you're attacking this ogre, and all of a sudden, Jarlaxle is on the back of the ogre, and he's looking down at Drizzt or whatever. And that doesn't make any sense. Or Artemis, I should have said Artemis. But that's not very thematic. Like, that's kind of weird. But at the beginning of the session, if you sit down just like 13th Age and the icon die, and everyone rolls their dice, and if you got a 1, now and maybe it's instead of a d6, you roll like a d10. So there's a 10% chance of this happening instead of a 16.5% chance or whatever it is. And so now they roll the d10. If they get a 10, their icon's going to help them, or 9 or 10 or something. But if they roll a 1, their nemesis is going to show up. And so now there's this nice little edge to the game where we're about to sit down for a 3-hour session, and so knows that somehow the DM's now going to tie this in. So that means that, maybe that's worse than the no planning, but I kind of think that gives some leeway to the DM, because now the player knows that you're kind of tap dancing this. It would have to mean that the nemesis would have to be some sort of card or simple stat block that's built out in advance, right? Where when you're creating your character, not only do you create your character, and maybe you do, because I love the Fate round, I think it's called the round, I forgot what it's called now, where during Fate character creation, you pass around stories to each other, etc. Maybe during that, one of the other players actually writes the backstory to your nemesis. And so now someone else kind of creates that nemesis backstory. And then you have a very simple stat block card that you write down the person, you write down the grievance, you write down whatever it is. And then those are all turned into the DM, and he just needs to flip to those. He needs to flip to that when you roll that 1. So, not sure how I want it to work. That's the budding spark of it. I would love to hear what you guys think, idea-wise, what you would do and how you would add that concept of a possible nemesis mechanic into your system, and how that can organically kind of flow into your sessions. So anyways, those are 2 short videos for this week. We'll get back into building the mechanics shortly. Actually, I want to kind of go into a deep dive of some other board games I love, and how we might be able to pull some of the mechanics, just like we talked about claustrophobia today, and we talked about those 2 again. I think we're done with Marvel and Arkham. I've got a ton of other games I want to try and pull from, so we're going to start diving into that also. All right, see you guys. Hit the bell, hit the subscription.